By dusk, the wind was screaming down from the Blacktail Ridge like a living thing, all claws and teeth and ghostly breath. Snow whipped sideways across the single street of Fallow Creek, erasing wagon tracks, footprints, even the sign over the saloon that once read Carter's Rest. Inside her small tea house, a thing built from scavenged boards and red paper once bright as lacquer, Mei-Lin Zhou, the Chinese widow, knelt beside a dying fire. She kept her hands cupped around the last bit of warmth, like it was a secret she wasn't ready to share. The floor trembled beneath the wind's assault, and every plank in the place moaned like it wanted to quit. Out on the street, men cursed the storm. Somewhere a shutter flew off and hit the mud with a sound like a slap. But Mei-Lin didn't flinch. She'd been, hit harder by words than by any winter. 2 years ago, when her husband, Liang Zhou, a railroad cook, froze to death crossing from Butte to Helena with his last pay wrapped in a rag, the town said it was karma. He stole white men's bread, they whispered. The widow's curse caught him. And when Mei-Lin stayed behind, tending her tea house and her small herb garden by the river, they said she brewed spells, not tea. Now, as the storm grew teeth, the same folks who spat at her door were hoarding their wood and praying to a god they never thanked in summer. But the widow, she just watched the coals die slow. A small rope hung above her hearth, frayed, knotted once, still stiff with old rain. It was the rope they used to drag her husband's body back to town. She'd kept it there, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. Never again, she'd told herself. Never let them bury you before you're dead. The door slammed open. Snow swept in like a ghost bride. A man stood there, half blind with frost, coat torn, one arm limp. His breath steamed. His hat was gone. Behind him, the wind howled the same 3-note cry the wolves did when they smelled weakness. "You can't be here," Mei-Lin said softly, voice low and accented but calm. He didn't answer, just stumbled once, then fell to his knees. A gun clattered from his belt. When she moved closer, she saw the Union Army tattoo on his wrist, half burned, skin puckered. He whispered something through cracked lips. Stagecoach. Overturned. Woman and child still out there. Then he passed out cold on her floor. Mei-Lin looked toward the door. The storm outside howled like judgment itself. The widow of Fallow Creek had a choice. Stay warm and alive, or step into a storm that didn't forgive. But something in the man's voice had broken the quiet like prayer. She wrapped her shawl tighter, lifted the rope from the wall, coiled it around her shoulder like a relic, and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind swallowed her name. But for the first time in 2 winters, she didn't feel cold. By the time Mei-Lin reached the ridge road, the storm had swallowed the world whole. Snow lashed her face raw. Her breath came in short, white bursts, each one a fight to stay real. The only sound was the wind, and the faint jangle of a broken harness somewhere ahead. She followed it until the shadows took shape. The overturned stagecoach, wheels half buried in drifts, the horse still hitched, frozen mid-lurch. One glassy eye open toward nothing. Its breath had stopped hours ago. Mei-Lin pressed her palm to its flank, cold as iron. She whispered something in Cantonese, half prayer, half apology, and moved on. Near the wreck, a woman's voice rose through the wind, ragged, small, desperate. "Help! Please! My boy!" Mei-Lin dropped to her knees, clawing through snow with bare hands until her fingers struck fabric. A small form, blue-lipped, still. And beside him, a mother, bleeding from her forehead, clutching him like he was the last warm thing left on earth. "Take him," the mother gasped. "Please, get him to town." Maylene tore her shawl in half, wrapped it around the child's chest, pressed her mouth near his to feel breath, faint but there. She looked at the mother again. The woman's lips were cracked, eyes dimming. "You must come, too," Maylene said. "I can't go." "You can." But Maylene could see truth written on her face like frost on glass. The woman was fading. With shaking hands, Maylene took the rope from her shoulder, the same one that had once dragged her husband home, and tied it around the child, fastening him to her chest. She gripped the woman's hand one last time. "What's his name?" The mother smiled weakly. "Eli." And then the storm took her. By the time Maylene reached the town's edge, her legs were numb, her face burned raw by wind. She stumbled through the snowdrifts toward the nearest barn, Harlan's livery, and kicked the door until it cracked open. Inside, the air was thick with hay and the sharp scent of horse sweat. Lantern light spilled over her and the small bundle tied to her chest. The boy's faint breathing misted against her neck. From the shadows, a deep voice barked, "Who the hell?" Then it stopped short. A tall man stepped forward. Jonas Harlan, the rancher. A widower with hands like old wood and eyes that had seen too much. He looked down at her, a Chinese woman wrapped in rags, carrying a white child through a blizzard. "What is this?" he said. Melan didn't answer. She just loosened the rope, revealed the boy's face. Jonas's breath caught. He knew the child, the banker's son. "Where's his ma?" he asked quietly. "Gone," Melan said. "Blizzard take her." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Get in the back. Fire's still burning." He took the boy, his big hands suddenly gentle, and laid him near the coals. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind screamed outside, and the rafters creaked. Then, almost to himself, Jonas muttered, "Town won't like this." Maylene looked up at him. "Town never liked me before." Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the road, the stagecoach, and the woman who'd trusted a stranger with her son. Inside the livery, Maylene tended the boy's breathing, while Jonas watched the storm rage like a judgment neither of them had earned. When she turned her face to the fire, its light caught the old rope lying by her feet, dark, frayed, and thawing drop by drop. It no longer looked like shame. It looked like a line between death and mercy. It doesn't take much for a town to turn savage. Just the sight of someone they already decided to hate doing the right thing. By morning, the snow had quieted, but the silence it left behind was worse than the storm. The streets of Fallow Creek lay buried under white mounds, smoke rising lazy from the chimneys that hadn't collapsed. The church bell was half frozen, but it still managed to toll, long, uneven, and cold as iron. Jonas Harlan walked through the drifts with the boy in his arms, Maylene following a few steps behind. Her shawl was stiff with ice, the rope coiled around her shoulder again, soaked but intact. The boy's lips were color returning, a faint blush of life. His breath was weak, but steady. When they reached the church steps, Reverend Collins was already there, coat pulled tight, face hard as frozen ground. "What's this?" the Reverend asked. "Survivor," Jonas said. "Stagecoach went down by the ridge. His ma didn't make it. Widow Joe pulled him out." The Reverend's eyes flicked to her. "Her?" He said it like a curse. "You brought that woman into the Lord's house?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "She saved the boy." Collins crossed his arms. "Or she took him to work her heathen charms. Don't forget who she is, Jonas. She was seen burying bones by the river last spring." Maylene stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "Bones of a rabbit. For the garden," the Reverend snorted. "Garden, spell, same thing." A few townsfolk had gathered now. Mrs. Keene, the grocer's wife, Tobias Bragg, who ran the feed store, and Hank Lyle, the drunk who never missed a crowd. Their faces were tight with fear dressed up as righteousness. "She's bad luck," Mrs. Keene whispered. "The storm came from her hand." "Then she ought to fix it," Tobias said. "Feed us, if she's so blessed." Jonas looked from face to face, and saw no mercy in any of them. "She did feed us," he said finally. "She fed this boy his life." That might have been the end of it, if the boy hadn't stirred just then, whispering weakly, "Mama!" The sound broke through the crowd like a gunshot. The Reverend faltered. Mrs. Keene lowered her eyes. Even Hank stepped back a little, his bluster melting into silence. Maylene knelt beside the child, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. "Rest, Eli," she murmured. "You are home." The word home landed heavy, because no one in that town had ever called her part of it. But the thaw didn't last long. By noon, talk had spread that the Chinese widow had stolen the boy from his dead mother, that she'd lured the stagecoach off the road with lantern lights, that she was keeping a rope of the dead to curse the living. Rumor, once born, doesn't need to walk. It flies. Jonas found her that evening, still in the livery, tending to the boy, while the fire dwindled. He set his hat on the table. "They're saying things again," he muttered. "Ugly things." "I know," she said simply. "You could run before it turns." Maylene looked into the flames, her eyes reflecting both warmth and something sharper. "I ran once already, across an ocean. Still, the storm found me." Jonas rubbed his scarred hand, the one with the old musket wound from Shiloh. "You're a fool to stay." "Then I stay as a fool," she said. "But the boy eats." For that night, the wind began again, softer this time, but biting cold. Maylene boiled rice, roots, and the last of her dried pork in a black pot by the hearth. The smell drifted through the cracks in the walls, out into the frozen street. And one by one, faces appeared at her door, hollow-eyed, hungry, ashamed. They didn't speak. They didn't thank her. They just waited. Maylene lifted her ladle, poured broth into wooden bowls, and handed them out one by one, until her pot was empty and her hands were trembling. She said only one thing before closing the door. "Even cold mouths deserve warm food." The snow hadn't yet melted, but the people of Fallow Creek had already decided what to burn. By morning, they had gathered in the town square, whispers passing like a contagion. It was the day of the trial, or at least that's what they called it, an impromptu council of fear and righteousness. And at its center stood Maylene Jo, the widow, as she had always been. Not a victim, not a martyr, but a symbol. A woman who'd crossed too many lines. Jonas Harlan stood at the back of the crowd, his heart a steady thud against his ribs. He didn't want to be here. Hell, he didn't want to be anywhere near Fallow Creek right now. But the choice had been made for him. By the time he reached the square, it was too late. The Reverend stood by the hastily erected gallows in the middle of the square, hands raised to quiet the murmurs. The sun beat down weakly through the clouds, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. "The widow must answer for her sins," Reverend Collins shouted, his voice thick with a righteousness that felt as cold as the wind. "For the curse she's brought upon us, for the boy she stole." Maylene stood at the base of the gallows, her eyes calm, her body still. She was no stranger to this kind of hatred, this kind of fear. The same rope that had been used to pull her husband back to town was now the one they intended to use on her. Jonas tried to push his way through the crowd, his boots crunching over snow and grit, but there were too many of them, too many faces already turned away from her, from him. No one would listen. "Jonas?" Maylene called out softly, her voice the only sound in the thickening silence. He turned to look at her, and for the first time he saw the weight of her defiance in her eyes. Not anger, but something else. Something that wasn't afraid of them. The rope, that was the thing. The very thing that tied them together, both broken and frayed, symbol and weapon. As the crowd gathered around, Harlan reached her side, the heavy creak of his boots echoing across the dirt. The rope was now wrapped around her wrist, a token of submission, of fate, but Maylene refused to let it be a shackle. "This is madness, Jonas," she whispered. "You must stop this." "They're gonna hang you," he muttered, his voice strained. "And they'll hang me too if I stand by." Maylene's eyes softened, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "Then we'll burn together." For a moment the wind stilled. The town square seemed to hold its breath, the murmurs turning into a low hum, like a buzzing wasp's nest about to break. The rope was already pulled tight around her neck, the crowd's voice rising in an eerie chant. Jonas stepped forward, his hands shaking, his face pale. He could see the townsfolk gathered, watching her like prey. But just as the lever was about to be pulled, a loud, guttural cry broke the air. A wolf, long-legged, wild-eyed, had appeared from the edge of town, its fur caked with snow and blood. The animal's eyes locked onto the crowd, its lips pulled back in a snarl. It stalked forward, each step punctuated by the rhythmic thud of its paws on the frozen earth. No one moved. The wolf, driven by something deeper than hunger or fear, stopped just beyond the edge of the gallows and turned its gaze to Maylene. It was as if the creature recognized her defiance, her unwillingness to be caged or silenced by men. It did not growl or bark. It simply watched, as if daring the townsfolk to make their next move. For the first time, the crowd quieted. Fear didn't just hang in the air now. It settled. "Release her," Jonas said, his voice a deep, guttural command. His hand shot to his gun, but the townsfolk stood frozen. No one dared speak. The rope hung heavy against Maylene's neck, and then from the crowd a child's voice rose, soft, quivering, but strong with innocence. "Let her go." It was Eli, the boy who had been saved from the wreckage. The crowd shifted, eyes darting from the child to the wolf to Maylene. It was as if something cracked inside their hardened hearts, a small defiance lighting the cold air. For a second, no one moved. The wolf stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Then, one by one, people began to step back. It was a small crack, barely visible, but it was enough. Jonas pulled the rope from her neck, his hands trembling but firm. "You're free," he whispered to Maylene before turning toward the townsfolk. "I won't let them hang you," Jonas said again, his voice carrying weight. "And I will leave this town if they raise a hand against you." But Maylene didn't look at him. She was still watching the townsfolk. Her shoulders relaxed, but there was no triumph in her eyes, only quiet survival. The wolf growled softly as it turned and disappeared into the forest, its dark form swallowed by the snow. Maylin's gaze followed it, before turning back to the crowd. "The storm has passed," she said simply, her voice carrying across the square. The days that followed the trial were quieter than they had any right to be. The snow still blanketed the town like a long-forgotten secret, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. But the tight knot of fear that had once held Fallow Creek in its grip began to loosen ever so slowly with each passing day. Jonas never left. He stayed on the edge of town, working his ranch with a quiet, stubborn defiance. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of him anymore. His loyalty to the widow, a kind of quiet rebellion that they couldn't ignore but could no longer silence. They could whisper, sure, but something had changed. The town could never quite shake the image of that wolf, its wild eyes meeting theirs, daring them to take the next step. Maylene, on the other hand, disappeared for a while. No one knew where she went. The wind shifted, and with it, the rhythm of town life began to change. Maylene had taken the old rope with her, not as a weapon, not as a symbol of her shame, but as a tool for something more, something that was hers alone. Ere weeks passed before anyone saw her again. By then the worst of the snow had melted, and the first hints of spring were beginning to creep through the frost. The ground, still frozen in places, was softening. The town began to hear rumors, whispered stories about a garden being planted behind the livery, strange crops growing where no one expected them. Jonas was the first to see it, the first to witness the quiet transformation that was taking place. He came by one evening after the sun had dropped behind the mountains. There, at the back of the livery, just beyond the barn's shadow, Maylene was bent over the earth, hands covered in dirt, her fingers working tirelessly at the soil. She didn't look up when he approached. He didn't say anything at first. The silence between them was comfortable, the way two people who've shared pain and survival can understand each other without words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maylene looked up. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes were alive with something he hadn't seen before, something that made her look less like the outcast widow and more like the woman who had survived everything and kept walking. "It's coming along," she said quietly, wiping her hands on the hem of her shawl. Jonas knelt beside her, brushing the dirt from a row of delicate seedlings. It was a garden, yes, but not just any garden. It was full of herbs, flowers, and vegetables that seemed foreign to the place. A mixture of everything that could grow in this cold, hostile land. The plants were small, tender, barely above the soil, but Jonas saw them for what they were, the beginning of something new. "What are you doing?" he asked softly, but there was no judgment in his tone. "I'm feeding the land what it needs," Maylene replied, her voice distant but warm. "Sometimes the earth has to be reminded that it can grow, even when it seems like all hope has died." Jonas's fingers brushed the earth as he studied the plants. "I never thought I'd see anything like this in Fallow Creek." "No one thought it could be done," Mylene said, "but the land still holds its secrets. You just have to listen to it." They sat there in the growing twilight, the silence between them now a bond instead of a gulf. The garden was a small rebellion, a quiet act of survival, in a place that had once tried to bury her. And the next morning, when the sun rose like a pale promise over the hills, something different had happened. Maylene's garden was no longer just a secret in the shadows. Word had gotten out. It spread quickly, like wildfire in a dry season. The townsfolk, curious but cautious, began to wander down to the livery, drawn by the whispers, the scent of herbs in the air, the sight of green where there had only been white. At first, they stood at the edge of the garden, unsure, eyes darting between the plants and the woman who had cultivated them. But then, one by one, they stepped forward. Mrs. Keene was the first to touch a leaf, hesitating as her fingers brushed the delicate stem. Then Tobias Bragg came closer, looking down at the strange mix of herbs and flowers. Slowly, the crowd began to grow, and so did the understanding. Maylene stood by, not saying a word. There was nothing left to prove. Her silence was the loudest declaration of all. That evening, after the last of the curious townsfolk had left, Jonas sat beside her on the porch of the livery. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the garden, now quiet and still. There was something peaceful in the air, something that hadn't been there before. "You've turned it around, haven't you?" Jonas said, his voice low. Maylene didn't answer right away. She simply watched the garden, her eyes soft. "Not yet, but I will." Jonas nodded, understanding what she meant. It wasn't about making everything right all at once. It was about survival, about planting something new, even if it had to grow from the broken soil of their past. As the days wore on, the town began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. There were still whispers, of course. The town could never fully shake the way it had treated her. But now, when they looked at Maylene, they didn't see just the widow, the outcast, the foreigner. They saw someone who had proven, in the quietest way possible, that even the harshest places could yield something new. By the time spring truly arrived, the garden was thriving. The flowers were blooming, the herbs were full and fragrant, and the vegetables were ripe for harvest. It wasn't just a garden. It was a testament to survival, a mark of her defiance, a symbol of the quiet power that could grow from hardship and pain. And as the town looked at the garden, at the small seeds she had planted in the cold ground, they couldn't help but feel the shift, a small crack in their own hearts. Something had changed. They couldn't take it back what they had done, but they could honor what had come from it. The first true warmth of spring had barely touched the soil of Fallow Creek when the real change began. It wasn't the bright sunlight that made the difference, though the days were growing longer. Nor was it the flowers that bloomed like whispers in Mylene's garden. It was the people, their gaze, their hesitations, their slowly turning hearts. The town was still gripped by its old fears, its deep-seated judgments, but there was no denying what had grown from that small patch of land. Every day, more and more townsfolk came by to see the garden. Some brought their children. Others stood by the fence, hands on their hips just watching. and little by little, the whispers of suspicion turned to quiet admiration. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a grand gesture, not some dramatic turning point. It was a slow, quiet change, the kind that settles into the bones when you least expect it. Mrs. Keene, the grocer's wife, was the first to come to Mylene and ask for a handful of herbs. At first, her voice was stiff, as if the old fear still lingered in her chest. But by the time she had picked the sage and thyme, she was talking about her own garden, about the trouble she'd had with the soil last year. She even smiled, awkwardly, but it was a smile. "I never thought I'd ask you for anything," Mrs. Keene said, half laughing, half apologizing. "But your garden, it's like magic." Mylene didn't respond right away. She just nodded and handed over the herbs. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was the silence of something that had been understood without words. Later, that week, Tobias Bragg came by with a basket, his broad shoulders hunched against the weight of whatever burden he was carrying. It was always hard to tell with Tobias, whose face was lined with suspicion, even in kindness. He handed Mylene the basket, full of the last of the apples from his orchard. "I owe you more than just this," he said, his voice gruff, but there was a strange softness in it now. "For the boy, for the garden, for showing us what it means to keep growing." Mylene took the basket without a word, her fingers brushing against his as she accepted it. In the silence that followed, there was no need for explanations. He didn't need to say more. They both understood. Sometimes the simplest acts, like offering what you have, even when you've been wronged, were enough to stitch a wound back together. That evening, after the sun had set and the stars began to pierce the darkness, Jonas came to find her in the garden. He had a quiet look on his face, the kind that said he wasn't sure what he was going to say but needed to say it anyway. "I spoke to the town," he said, his voice low. "They want to make things right." Mylene didn't look at him immediately. She was kneeling in the soil again, pulling weeds from the base of the newly sprouted tomatoes. The action was simple, but it spoke to something deeper, a quiet acceptance, not of forgiveness, but of survival. "They want to give you back your land," Jonas continued. "The property your husband had, the house, everything. They want to make things right." Mylene finally looked up at him, her face unreadable in the pale light. Her gaze softened, but it didn't soften in the way he might have hoped. Instead, it was something else, a knowing. A peace that came with knowing exactly who she was, and that nothing could be taken from her that hadn't already been lost. "I don't need it," she said quietly, her voice a soft murmur against the evening wind. "I have what I need here. I've built something better than land." Jonas paused, his expression unreadable. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Mylene stood and reached for a small, smooth stone from the edge of the garden bed. She held it up between her fingers, turning it slowly in the light. It was an ordinary stone, weathered by time, but there was something about it that spoke to her. She placed it gently in Jonas's hand. "This is mine," she said softly, "and it always has been." Jonas's fingers closed around the stone, a subtle understanding passing between them. That night, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the town's decision reached its end. It had been quiet, unspoken, but it was clear to all of them now. Mylene had won not with her fists or her words, but with the quiet strength of someone who had endured and kept surviving. The sheriff came by the livery the next morning, his face grim but respectful. "We've decided," he said. "You've earned your place here, Mylene Joe. No more accusations. No more whispers." Mason nodded, not surprised, but grateful in the way one is for rain after a long drought. Days passed, the garden grew, and the town began to change, quietly and without fanfare. The people who had once turned their backs on Mylene now found themselves drawn to her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They brought her what they had to give, from baskets of food to simple words of thanks. The town wasn't perfect, and the road wasn't smooth, but the cracks in its foundation had begun to fill with something new. And through it all, Mylene worked in her garden, her hands in the soil, her mind as steady as the earth beneath her feet. She planted new seeds of herbs, of vegetables, of hope. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, she had finally found the place she could call home. This quiet survival, this reclaiming of self, was the true victory. Malin stood alone in her garden one evening, looking out at the town that had once tried to break her, now slowly starting to heal. She wasn't looking for applause or recognition. She had everything she needed. As she turned to go inside, her eyes caught the faint glow of the firelight in the distance. Her garden, her life, they were small rebellions, quiet victories, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of survival, courage, and quiet victories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories that will leave you thinking long after the last word.